morphologically African, but with pink skin, the albino type. This albanization, which would have been fatal in Africa and in certain tropical countries, becomes a stabilized type in Europe, a selected type, and so you have the pink type emerging, eventually undergoing facial morphological change, the narrower nose, thinner lips, etc., contracted features, longer hair, which is necessary to protect the neck from cold, as against the hair that is shorter in order to allow heat loss in the tropics. So then you have mutations, not evolution, but mutation. And then you find going into Asia, the Africoid type, as Renoka Rashidi has shown, there are 100 million blacks still in Asia. That mutation occurred, the beginning, for example, of the epicantic fold to deal with the wind across the Asian steppes. Then we have anomalies like the Eskimo, which remains black in the ice because he does not have to drop pigmentation to survive because he's near. He gets his vitamin D from the seals and from fish oils, which the black caught in the ice of southwestern Russia and in parts of Spain, etc., could not accommodate himself to this new situation without the loss of pigmentation. What they have found within the last few years, within the last 5 years, in fact, it is reported in Nature that the founding population of the modern world is African. It is not just that the first man is African. That was known for a long time, and that doesn't mean anything because man went through various sequences in evolution. They found that all the 6 sequences are African and that the final man, which makes modern man with the brain of modern man, is African.
Just by way of comparison, the oldest Homo sapiens sapiens bones that we find in Europe are 50,000, about 40,000 to 50,000 years old. This is the Grimaldi skeletons that were found in the Grimaldi cave.
So you have the African, how long ago now?
You have the African at least 200,000 years before they moved to the European continent.
And the European comes on the scene when?
Well, the African comes on the scene in Europe approximately 50,000 years ago. In other words, the first European was an African too, and is still an African. It's just an African who has changed.
And once again, what happened to that African once he got to Europe?
Well, you had several ice ages that and a change in environment, and the theory is that the change in environment and especially the ice age part of it, being cut off from the African continent, having a completely different environment with respect to diet and climate and all those things, resulted over a 20,000 year period in physical changes, genetic mutations to adapt to that particular environment. And about 20,000 years or so ago, we have changes sufficient that we look and see distinct people when they really aren't distinct in that sense, in the sense of having groups that can't interbreed. That's what one of the biological definitions of race is, that groups can't, a dog and a cow can't have offspring, so they would be different strains, but varieties of the same family, so that the European that resulted was merely a depigmented African.
Okay, let's go on.
Okay. Okay, the New York Times had an interesting article which was about the oldest nation in the world, and this is an example of what I was just talking about.
Back to the chart.
Here's Kemet, 3100 BC, beginning, but in the New York Times they tell us there was another nation that is somewhere around 3500 BC. At least 200, maybe 300 or 400 years older than Kemet. There's this nation called Tasseti, and this nation is further up south on the river in an area called Nubia, and that is called the oldest monarchy in the world. And of course they excavated the graves of these kings in Nubia, and these kings in Nubia were said to be tall, black-skinned people. The goddess Isis and her child were already in place at the beginning of Kemet.
Which was, when you said
which was
Already at the
3100 BC.
Dynastic,
And then that's dynastic Kemet. So dynastic Kemet begins after the religion that was the primary religion of Kemet had already been created. So when you go to Taseti, for example, there is God Horus. This child that's being held by the Virgin Mother is already recorded in Taseti, south of Kemet, and it's much older than Kemet. So the religion is in place, astronomy is in place, writing, the hieroglyphics or Medu Neter is in place. All of those things are already in place. So the culture is in place before the political organization of Kemet as a nation.
Okay.
So you have Africans scattered all over the world from that first phase. If not for these early migrations out of Africa, the world would have remained devoid of human life. It would have remained a desert. So we are the original people, the aboriginal people of the world, and there's no part of the world that we are strangers in, and there's no part of the world that we cannot claim as our own. That's a very important distinction to make, that our history doesn't begin with slavery, but our history begins as the first humanity. But it's not enough to say that you were first. It's very important to be able to talk about what you did. And what did we do? We did some magnificent things, and we've only scratched the tip of the iceberg in terms of African achievement. For example, in the realm of civilization itself, we could start in Africa with the Nile Valley civilization, of which Egypt of the pharaohs is the prime example. But those same Africans laid the basis, planted the seeds, sisters and brothers, for civilization in the Tigris-Euphrates, long before Saddam Hussein was a twinkle in anybody's eye. They went and planted the seeds of civilization in Pakistan, in the Indus Valley civilization, and in the Yangtze and Yellow River civilizations in China, in Southeast Asia, in ancient America, and even in ancient Europe. And then you have the enslavement period. The problem is we typically begin our look at Africa from the perspective or from the time of enslavement, as though we never did anything. We waited for a white man to come in the room and turn on the light, and we were just chilling until he got there. We didn't do anything, is the assumption that we have, and I'm insulted by that. Or we believe that the history of Africa begins with colonization, and so you automatically have a stigma. Many people in the United States are so ignorant, black folk, African Americans, Africans living in America, that it is not unusual for us to say, thank God for slavery, because at least it got us out of Africa. Can you imagine another ethnic group saying, thank God for the Holocaust because it got us out of Europe? But we are taught to hate ourselves.
Slide, please. The pyramid rises to a height of 481.5 feet. It is built of 2.7 million blocks of stone. The smallest stone is 2.5 tons, and the largest stone is somewhere between 70 and 100 tons. If you were to take the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid, by the way, can you hear me in the back? I don't want you to miss any of this. If you could take all of the intact masonry of the Great Pyramid and cut it up into 1-foot blocks, you could build a wall that would circle 2/3 of the globe. And you know they built it without even using the wheel? They used to float 1,000-ton blocks of granite from Aswan 500 miles down the river, and they can't even do that today. The pyramid was oriented precisely to the 4 cardinal points. The base of the pyramid, the side of each base of the pyramid was 755 feet, 6 inches, with an average error of 1/10,000th. The casing stones that covered the pyramid were so finely jointed that you could not and cannot insert a piece of your hair in between the joints, even today, where they are still in existence. The area of the base of the pyramid is 13 acres. But it's real interesting. If you look at the height of the pyramid, it is, if you measure it, it is the radius of a circle that you can create by turning the base of the square base of the pyramid into a circle. And therefore you can find the square base by the area of the perimeter of the square base by 2 pi r. So that means they had built the constant, the geometric constant of pi, into the pyramid. The descending passage was precisely aligned to the North Pole star that was in place 3,350 years BC, and it used to shine down to the grotto into a pool of water, and of course it's only in that place once every 26,000 years. The so-called ventilating shaft of the King's Chamber oriented exactly to Orion in the southern heavens, and the one from the Queen's Chamber is oriented exactly to Sirius, also in the southern heaven. There has never been any
that led into Sneferu's son Akekufu to build the Great Pyramid as we know it. Here we 7 million tons of masonry, 2,300,000 stones put in exact position. Originally it had white limestone that covered into the Arabs tore it off to build buildings around Cairo. 755 feet on each square, originally 481 feet in height. Let's look at this, brothers and sisters, because going up into the Grand Gallery, 155 feet, these stones are here 50 tons each that were carried from the area of Ta-Nehisi or Aswan, over 500 miles away.
Dynasty. But where are the books, they say? The earliest books in the world are African. The Book of the Dead, or rather it should be called the Book of the Coming Forth by Night and Day. The pyramid texts, the Papyrus of Ani. You will hear tomorrow from Dr. Ben the profound impact of those books upon the thinking of the Greeks. Look at the medical literature of the world. They said the clinical method began with the Greeks. It did not. You can read the Edwin Smith Papyrus. Dr. Finch, whom you will hear tomorrow. Dr. Finch has done a commentary recently for the journal on the Edwin Smith Papyrus, showing it is only 1/3 of an earlier manuscript written down in the 18th dynasty by a surgeon in Egypt, and that it only deals with the head and neck and the brain. Yet there are 200 terms. There are 200 medical terms for things inside and outside the head. He said that they discovered in that very early time things which we only know today through X-rays. He said that they found the locus in the brain through which auditory information is processed. They were working on pulse taking 1,000 years before Herophilus, the Greek who was credited with pulse taking. And so, how could you compare Sumer with Egypt? Ur, Lagash, and those places, those were city-states. They did not have the centralized network, the empire that the Egyptians created. And look at their writing system, the cuneiform tablets, the merchant bills and notes. They did not have the great literature of the Egyptians. Where is their literature compared to the literature of the Egyptians? The thousands of things that we have found even today in spite of the devastation. And look at their architecture. Who could compare the architecture of the Egyptians with the Sumerians? We cannot even reconstruct the Mesopotamian temple when the Egyptian works stand immortal upon the face of the earth. When the Sphinx, when the Great Pyramid was finished and it had its polished limestone casing, they say it was like a star over the earth. You could stand for hundreds of miles and see it shining. What is there in Sumer and in Babylon like that? They say the stone that was involved in the building of the Great Pyramid could build 30 Empire State Buildings. If you were to cut it into 1-foot cubes, it would encircle 2/3 of the belly of this planet. What are they talking about? And you look at all these things, you look at the medical documents you find in those Edwin Smith papyri, helminthiasis, ophthalmology, gynecology, pregnancy diagnosis, many things, studies of the pulse, studies in diagnostic percussion, fractures of the clavicle, dislocation in the mandible. Word for word, Hippocrates takes out the fractures of the clavicle and dislocation in the mandible and puts it in his work. And he's the father of medicine. Things, but their debt to Egypt was profound. And they admitted that. They admitted it. Even the gods, they took Zeus and all sorts of gods and goddesses out of Egypt. The goddess of chastity is Artemis, a black woman. Circe in the Odyssey is a black woman with African features, not just ritually black. Andromeda is represented as a woman with black skin in some of the early Grecian vases. Andromeda, who married Perseus, the Greek hero. And Medea, who helped Jason win the golden fleece, is represented as a black woman. And Isis, the mother of God, the sister of God, the wife of God, the female principle of the divine. She is not just worshipped among Africans, she becomes the major figure among the Europeans. Even Caligula, the Roman lunatic, worshipped Isis. It is found even in the British Isles. And Isis and Horus were first seen as Mary and Jesus, until Michelangelo comes in the scene and starts painting his family as Jesus. We just have to be very careful, and this is something that happens in all movements, not to claim that everything is black. That is not necessary. The contributions of the black to the world are so great in terms of what we know now that it is not necessary to claim things that are not necessarily true. In the field of medicine, for example, they have found incredible things. They found vaccines among Africans long before Edwin Jenner. They found the smallpox vaccine had been brought to this country by Onesimus, a slave of Cotton Mather. They found that the Africans were using aspirin long before the Western nations, that the Bantu were using Salix capensis, which yields salicylic acid, the main active ingredient in aspirin. They found the Africans had made breakthroughs in eye cataract surgery. In the 13th century, Africans were performing eye cataract surgery in the Empire of Mali, in the city of Djenné. Nobody in the world was performing eye cataract surgery at the time. And there were certain surgeries in Africa which taught surgeries which had a profound effect on surgery in Europe. In the 1870s, whenever the cesarean operation was performed, the cesarean section was performed in women, the woman invariably died in Europe. Because of the British Empire, the British learned that Africans were performing the cesarean successfully. A team under Dr. Felkin went out to East Africa among the Banyoro surgeons to study how they were performing this operation. They noted, please note, that the Africans had developed their own anesthetics and their own antiseptics. Antiseptics had only been introduced in an European operating theater by Lister 2 years earlier than the witness of this operation. Many doctors in Europe did not know, as late as the 1870s, that even if you perform a successful operation, your hands, the poison in your fingertips will kill the patient. They did not have proper antiseptics. They washed their hands in water. They found the Africans were using sterile antiseptics. They saw how they cut. They saw how they collapsed the abdominal wall. They saw how they took the baby out. They saw how they were able to take the cautery iron and stop internal bleeding almost instantly with minor tissue damage. They saw how the Africans stitched. They drew the stitches. They brought it back to Europe. And the cesarean operation after that was performed with far greater success. Nobody knows, unless you study the history of medicine, that that was what happened.